welcome everybody to this, our first event. I am Dr. Yvonne Kason. I am the president and the co-founder of Spiritual Awakenings International. And I'm just absolutely delighted at how Spiritual Awakenings International has just blossomed and grown since we launched it a week ago, and how so many of you have signed up for our very first online event today. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much, John. Hello, everybody. I'm going to share a screen just for a couple moments. Be patient with me. Hopefully this will work fine before I start telling you my story. So yes, I'm Dr. Yvonne Kason, as I mentioned, and it's my pleasure today to talk to you all about discovering spiritually transformative experiences, my inner and my outer journey. And everything I'm talking about today is in my wonderful new book, Touched by the Light, that John mentioned, in case any of you are interested. So what I want to talk to you all about first is, how did I, as a medical doctor, get interested in things like near-death experiences and spiritually transformative experiences? Well, as you will find out, it's because of what happened to me, that during my medical school training in 1976, I had what I now know is a Kundalini Awakening. And then in 1979, when I was a medical resident, I was in a plane crash during a medevac, and I had what I now know was a near-death experience. And a few weeks afterwards, I had what I now know was a psychic awakening. But back then, I had no idea what these experiences were. And so I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to tell you the stories of these three experiences that changed the course of my life. So back in 1976, when I was in medical school, there was a meditation course being offered at the university I was attending at McMaster University. And they advertised it that it would help you be more relaxed, so you'd get better marks in your exams, you'd be able to study better. And because I was in my last year of medical school, of course I wanted to get better marks and study better. So I took this meditation course, and I wasn't trying to have like a spiritual experience or a transcendental experience at all. I was really taking it to try and study better and do well on my exams. But once I learned how to meditate, I discovered I really loved it. I felt like a duck being introduced to water, like it was a fit, and I really enjoyed meditating. So I started meditating regularly, an hour in the morning, an hour in the evening. And lo and behold, after about 3 months of regularly meditating, I had a really powerful experience where suddenly I was in a group meditation. I felt this, I heard a large, loud inner sort of roaring sound, like the roar of a waterfall. And then I felt this energy rise up my body and spine, and then up through the top of my head. And then it seemed like me, or my perception where I look from, rose out of my body. And I found myself up above my body, maybe 20, 30 feet above my body. And then the sense of I no longer seemed to be sort of the size of my head or my body. I seemed to expand to fill this vast space. And in this expanded space, I also transformed into like a force field of love. And I felt this incredible, beautiful, joyful love. And, you know, had no idea what was happening to me. And at the time, what I thought was that this is what all the experienced meditators were experiencing every time they meditated. And I was sort of embarrassed that it took me this long to get my technique right, that I was finally having like the it experience that everyone else I thought was having. Well, at the end of my meditation, I came back down into my normal state of consciousness. And then I couldn't figure out why I was not having this experience when I kept on meditating after that. I mean, I was having other things, like I was having rushes of energy up my spine, and I was having all sorts of unusual inner sounds, inner ringing, inner rumbling, stuff like that, energy sensations. But I now know it was a Kundalini Awakening. But back then in 1976 in medical school, I had no idea what this was. So, but I put it aside because I was focusing on my studies. And how I now look at it is that while I was continuing my worldly medical studies, that the divine power, spirit, was giving me my spiritual training. It was giving me spiritual experiences that were training me for what was going to be my career path later on, specializing in spiritually transformative experiences. Anyway, that's how I now look back at it. So then I continued and I became a medical resident, and I continued to meditate regularly. And then in my last year of my medical residency, on March 27th, 1979, I was working in a remote community in Northern Ontario, Sioux Lookout, and I was assigned on a medevac with a critically ill Native Indian woman. And this medevac was by a small airplane, and it was not by helicopter, it was by a twin propeller airplane called a Piper Aztec. So on this day, I was in this airplane tending to this patient, was very, very ill, intubated. She had a tube in her airway. So I had this bag called an ambu bag that I had to be contracting in order that she could breathe. And there was a nurse in the plane too, and she was tending to the 2 IVs. And then there was a pilot, a very small plane. We filled the plane. Anyway, as we were on the medevac, we were en route to Winnipeg, where we were trying to bring the patient to a larger hospital that had intensive care facilities for her critical condition. The plane flew into a blizzard and the plane crashed. And the plane crashed onto the surface of a semi-frozen lake. And as soon as the plane came to a stop, its wake broke through the ice and it sank. And I very rapidly had to climb out of this plane while it was sinking. I managed to pull the nurse out. I was trying to pull the patient out, but the plane then suddenly nosedived and sank into very, very deep water. And then I found myself in a lake, and the closest shore was a long distance away. They say about 200 yards, but an inner voice said very loudly in my head, "Swim to shore." At first, I sort of argued with the inner voice. I'd not had higher guidance experiences before that. I remember thinking, no, you're not supposed to do that. I took lifeguarding. They tell you don't try to swim to shore. You'll drown on the way. But the voice repeated, "Swim to shore." So finally, the third time the voice repeated, "Swim to shore," I finally surrendered to that higher wisdom and started swimming to shore. Now, it was a long and a very difficult swim. You have to imagine, this was the middle of winter, sub-zero weather, in a blizzard. The water had a fast-moving current, which was why the ice had not frozen there. I was wearing heavy winter clothes, a heavy parka, heavy boots. The weight of these clothes were just pulling me down like lead weights. And the place that I crashed, believe it or not, is called Devil's Gap. And the reason it has that name is because it's very treacherous in the winter and in the summer because of the strong current there. So I had to swim the Devil's Gap in order to get to shore. So anyway, I started swimming. Fortunately, I was a very strong swimmer at that age, but it was a very difficult swim. And I went under several times in the course of swimming to shore, and my lungs would fill with lake water, and I would use all my strength to kick and kick and kick to try and get my head above water again and gasp in some more air, and then to keep on swimming. Anyway, partway to shore, all of a sudden I hear a loud roaring noise again, like the roar of a waterfall. And I found my consciousness lift up, and suddenly I'm like, my point of perception is like 20 or 30 feet above my body, and I'm looking down. Now, my body was not dead. My body was still struggling to swim to shore. And it was a very unusual sensation because it was really like my consciousness was 2 places at once. And I compare it to like a large, a split screen TV where you have the big picture where most of the picture that you see, and that was my consciousness that was out of my body. That's where most of my awareness was out of my body. But there was still a tiny little picture in the corner at the same time where there was a little bit of my consciousness was still in that body that was struggling with all its might to swim to shore. So there I am in the out of body watching this, and all of a sudden I rose up to an even higher place. And where I found myself was in a realm that was filled with light and with love. It was a beautiful, soft, diffused, glistening white light area. It was dark and stormy in the world, but I'd gone somewhere that was incredibly peaceful, incredibly beautiful, and the light was soft. What I've compared it to, my experience, it was like before the plane is going to break out of the top of the clouds into bright sunlit sky above, where it's all light and glistening and a soft white glow. That was what the white light realm was for me. It was that sort of a soft, bright, glistening white light. For an instant, I did see a face of light briefly, and then that face of light seemed to fade into the periphery, the cloud-like periphery. And while I was in this realm of light, it was not the light that was the most remarkable thing for me. It was the love that I was feeling. I was feeling such incredible, perfect, pure, vast, unconditional love. It was the most perfect love I had ever felt. And I felt like I was home, that this is where I belonged. And somehow I knew things while I was being permeated with this love, not because I heard a voice telling me, it was just somehow I knew, somehow I understood things. And what I knew was that this love that I was feeling was the love of the higher power, or what I call God. And I could sense its vastness, infinite vastness that permeates all exists. And I could sense its intelligence, immense, vast intelligence. We're like little grains of sand compared to the intelligence of this vast force underlying the universe, what I call God. And as I was experiencing it, God was not at all like what I had been taught in my religion of childhood. It was not an old man sitting on a throne with a beard judging us, you know, have you been good? Have you been bad? It was not at all what I was experiencing. It was what I was experiencing is much more compatible with some of the Eastern religions when they talk about a universal force that is underlying and interpenetrating all of creation. Anyway, in this realm of light, I watched with sort of detached interest what was happening to the scene below, to my physical body. I really didn't care whether I lived or died, because I knew that what I think of as me, would live on if my physical body died down below. And where I was in the light was a wonderful place to be. So I really had no attachment to whether my body managed to live or it died in the scene happening below. Anyway, as it turned out, through a whole series of coincidences, if you believe in coincidences or the grace of God, if you want to know them, you can read in my book. I describe all the things that happened. But through a bunch of coincidences, there was a helicopter there that day when normally there wouldn't be a helicopter, and somebody picked up our message when normally nobody would have picked up our distress message. And anyway, the helicopter found us. They brought us to the closest hospital, which was Kenora Hospital. I watched floating from above. The helicopter landed on the driveway of the hospital, and then the emergency staff came running out with their little gurneys to the helicopter, and they placed me in one of the gurneys, and they wheeled me into the emergency department. And I remember watching from above as a nurse was trying to take my temperature, and she was really puzzled. She was looking at her thermometer because she wasn't able to get a reading. And of course, she wasn't able to get a reading because my body temperature, I was hypothermic. I was almost frozen to death. My body temperature was lower than the lower reading of her standard thermometer. So, and then as I watched from above, I started feeling myself drifting further and further away from my body. And I knew that I was dying, and that was fine. I was totally at peace with that. And then I remember hearing a voice say, "Boy, could I use a hot bath." And I was shocked to realize that those words came out of my physical body, because I hadn't been thinking that. I hadn't been planning on saying that, but somehow out of my mouth came the words, "Boy, could I use a hot bath." And it turns out that's exactly what my body needed in order to be resuscitated. So some higher wisdom spoke through my mouth that day. And then the nurses looked at each other and said, "Gee, maybe that'll help them. Let's take them down to the physiotherapy department, put them in the hot whirlpool baths," which they did. And when they finally submerged my body in the hot whirlpool bath in the physiotherapy department, when my body reheated, was when I felt my consciousness re-enter my body. And what that felt like was like this. It felt like I'd been in this big, vast space up above, and suddenly I was sucked down. It felt like through the top of my head into the small confines of my body. It's like what I imagine it would feel like for a genie being sucked into a tiny bottle. That's what it felt like. And then I knew that I was back. I knew that I was going to live. Now, I had no words to describe this experience. I had no idea what this experience was. And thank goodness I had a month off work immediately afterwards because of my frostbite, and I was recovering from near drowning and all that stuff, because I needed some time to sort of process and to integrate what had happened to me, because this experience was incredibly impactful. I mean, number one, when I came back, I was like drunk with love. It's as if some of the love that I experienced over there had come back with me. And I was just so full of love. And I remember I'd be sitting there in my home and I'd be looking at the squirrels playing on the lawn, and I would feel waves of love for the squirrels coming out of my heart. Or I'd see some children playing in the street and I would feel waves of love for the children coming out of my heart. Similarly, listening to music, you know, I'd listen to anything about love, anything about any positive theme, and oh, waves of love and tears of joy would be streaming down my face. I was just it's like I was love intoxicated when I first came out of this experience. But not only that, it carried on into human relationships too. I had been feuding with my father for several years before this. You know how teenagers and young adults, you have issues with your parents. Well, I'd been feuding with my father and we hadn't talked for a few years. And after I had this experience, which I now know was a near-death experience, but I didn't know then, something changed in me. And I called my father up and I said, Dad, I love you. Let's be friends. And we talked, we reconciled, and we had a beautiful relationship for 7 years after that, until my father died. An incredibly close, loving relationship. And I look at that as one of the biggest gifts that I got out of this near-death experience, was the healing of this relationship with my father. You see, my father hadn't changed. He still had the same quirks and eccentricities that he had before I had the NDE. It's me that changed. It's my heart had opened, and those things that my ego had thought were so important before they were not important anymore. What mattered was the love that I felt. And this experience also dramatically affected my spiritual views. I became much, much more liberal and tolerant in my spiritual views, because I somehow knew intuitively that the same one higher power, which I call God, is the same one higher power that all the world's religions and all the world's spiritual paths are all trying to understand or commune with, and that they're just using different names or going a slightly different route, like different paths all going up the same mountain. But when you get up to the top, it's all the same peak that you're going to get to, the same one God. So I became much more compassionate and tolerant of people with different spiritual views. I also completely lost my fear of death. I mean, it was like a joke to be afraid of death, because in fact, it's so much nicer on the other side than it is here. So this had tremendous, tremendous spiritual and psychological impact on me. And, you know, when I went back to work, I started talking with my doctor friends and colleagues and saying, hey, you know, I had this really profound experience. I didn't have a word to call it. I said, has anybody ever heard of anything like this? And when I talked to my doctor friends, they were all very interested. They'd all heard about the plane crash during the medevac, and they all knew that I was a very responsible physician. So nobody put up the craziness theory, fortunately. But everybody came up with a hallucination theory. So every doctor I talked to said, oh, it's a hallucination. You hallucinated because you had a low blood sugar, or you hallucinated because you had an electrolyte imbalance. And that just did not resonate as truth for me, because I'd seen people with low blood sugars and with electrolyte imbalances. This thing had transformed my life in a positive spiritual way. I knew it was something more than an electrolyte imbalance. So I slowly started going into the closet. I stopped talking about what had happened to me because I was not getting any sort of validation from people around me. The closest word I found in my research as I started looking was a mystical experience. So for almost 10 years, I called what happened to me in that plane crash a mystical experience. Then lo and behold, about a few weeks after I had that experience, I had what I now know was a psychic awakening. I was driving to visit a friend one evening, and I was stopped at an intersection at a red light. And all of a sudden, in my mind's eye, clear as could be, I got an image of a glistening brain covered in pus. And somehow, I don't know how, I absolutely knew it was my friend's brain, the friend I was going to visit. And as a medical doctor, the symbology was perfectly clear to me. It was meningitis. And sure enough, when I arrived at my friend's house that day, I asked how she was feeling. She was not feeling well. She had a fever, really bad headache. And later that day, when she went to the emergency department, she was indeed diagnosed with acute meningitis. So that was my first clairvoyant experience, which I then started having more clairvoyant, clairaudient, clairsentient experiences. So something was happening in me, something was changing. It wasn't just an isolated experience. I was having more experiences, which now people talk about as NDE After-Effects. But back then, nobody knew about these things. And in fact, when I went to see somebody in Toronto, because I was living in Toronto, who considered themselves an NDE expert, I asked them if my plane crash experience could possibly have been a near-death experience. And so this person said to me, well, did you see a tunnel with the light at the end of it? And I said, no. And he said, and were you clinically dead at any time? And I said, well, no. I mean, the closest I came was probably unconscious when I was hypothermic. And then he told me definitively, this was not a near-death experience, which of course now we know that's incorrect. But back then I thought, okay, if it's not a near-death experience, what is it? So for about 10 years after that near-death experience in the medevac plane crash, I was in the closet and I led a double life. So my outer life, I was a Western-trained medical doctor. I got a teaching position at the University of Toronto. I excelled in my career. I did extremely well. So that was my public life. But in my private life, in the closet part of my life, I was a mystic and a spiritual seeker. You know, I was meditating regularly. I was researching everything I could about diverse types of spiritual experiences, about Kundalini Awakenings, which I slowly started realizing had happened to me in medical school, mystical experiences, because I figured that's what I had in the plane crash, psychic phenomenon, because I was now starting to experience lots of psychic phenomenon. Also near-death experiences, because I thought, well, you know, there's a chance it might be a near-death experience. And anyway, so this is the double life that I led for many years. And then something interesting started happening in my career as a medical doctor, is that somehow through the grapevine, people started hearing about me, that there is this doctor in Toronto that you can go and see. And if you've had some sort of spiritual or paranormal experience, she won't automatically say you're crazy. So over the years, more and more and more and more people came to see me in my office as patients. And in the confidential environment of my medical office, they were telling me about these incredible STEs they were having. I mean, I had not yet coined the phrase, but mystical experiences, past life recall, you know, Kundalini Awakenings, near-death experiences, some of them, inspired creativity, this whole gamut of experiences. But I would be supportive, but I was doing this privately in secrecy in my office. Then that all changed in 1990. In 1990, I was invited to speak at a conference in Asilomar, which is in California, that was being hosted by the Institute for Transpersonal Psychology and the Spiritual Emergence Network. And this conference was on Kundalini. Now, I had back in the 70s, around the time of my Kundalini, by coincidence, if you believe in coincidence, traveled to India with my meditation group, and I had met Gopi Krishna, who is a pioneer in bringing awareness of Kundalini Awakening to the West. And so he had become a mentor to me, and he taught me a lot about Kundalini. So I was invited to come and speak at this conference about Kundalini. And when I was there, I was so moved. I was so blown away, because most of the people attending, they were psychologists, some social workers. There were very few MDs in the crowd. I was labeled as an MD. And So many people came up to me, experiencers, people who had STEs, crying, telling me their horror stories of how they've been mistreated, how they've been labeled as crazy, how they've been put in a psychiatric hospital, given electroshock treatment even, and how much it meant to them to find an MD, somebody with the initials MD after their name, who finally believed them that they were having a spiritual awakening, a spiritual experience. I was profoundly, profoundly moved by this. And I went for a walk that evening out in the sand dunes in the Asilomar, and I had a profound STE, which I call my calling mystical experience. And all of a sudden, it was like my head cracked open, and where my head used to be, there was a beacon of light going 360 degrees in all direction. And I could taste the nectar, the amrita that's sometimes talked about in the back of my throat. And in this state of illumination, revelation, I don't know what word we're going to put to it, I suddenly knew, I knew without words being spoken, what I was being called to do. I was being called to come out of the closet. It was time now to become public, to talk about some of the experiences that I personally have had, and to become an advocate, to advocate for people who've had diverse spiritually transformative experiences, because they are not crazy. And the medical profession and the public and also many churches were doing harm by labeling people who were having these experiences as crazy. So when I got back from that conference, my whole life changed. My two worlds came together. I went to my department chairman at the university and said, you know, I'll give up my teaching position if you want, but I am now going to specialize my practice in the counseling and the research of people who've had diverse types of spiritual and paranormal experiences. And I swear my guardian angels must have overshadowed my department chair that day, because he sat back and he listened to me and he says, you know, so this all started with that plane crash you had when you were a resident at the University of Toronto. And he says, you know, Yvonne, as long as you're doing research, it's okay with me. So shortly after that, I opened up in Toronto the Spiritual Emergence Research and Referral Clinic. And I announced it to all the doctors of Ontario, and I was deluged with people coming to see me who wanted to talk to me about their spiritual experiences. So this was my medical career, and I loved it. And I continued advocating. Over the years in Canada, I was a little bit famous. I was on television lots of times. I was written up in the newspaper as a cover of a magazine once. I was even in one of those rag things where they they tell false gossip about you. You know, that a doctor floats out a body and heals patients or something is what they said. Well, that's not quite what happened to me. But anyway, so this was all through the 90s, and I wrote my first two books, A Farther Shore and Farther Shores, and spoke to all sorts of audiences internationally. But all of that changed on November the 8th, 2003. On November the 8th, 2003, I had a serious slip and fall accident in Niagara Falls, Ontario. I fell, I hit my head on the ground. I had a serious traumatic brain injury and a brain hemorrhage, and I died. Instantly, I felt my consciousness whisked out of my body by a force greater than myself. I was rushing up through a dark expanse of space, I suppose what some people call the tunnel. And then I found myself in that realm of light again. And this time I was being welcomed into the realm of light by two beings of light in their light bodies, two saints from my spiritual tradition whom I love and that I instantly recognized. They were Paramahansa Yogananda and Mahavatar Babaji. And they telepathically communicated to me that I had died, that my work in the body of Dr. Yvonne Kason was now finished. And there was this feeling of love, There was this feeling of welcome. There was this feeling of celebration, like that there was a graduation party being held for me, that I had completed my assignment as Dr. Yvonne Kason. And I remember there was this part of me that was sort of feeling like, uh-oh, here it comes. You know, I'm going to go through a life review and I'm going to have to face all of the mistakes that I have done, because, you know, nobody's perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. But the love was so powerful and so unconditional. It was like, oh, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. And it was just the understanding, sort of like how when a parent watches a child that's learning how to walk, that the child will stumble, the child will fall, it'll make mistakes, it'll hit its head. But the parent understands that's just all part of the learning curve that you have to go through. And it was that sort of love and understanding that I was met with on the other side. And then I went into this space that I don't know how to describe it, but I'm going to call it pure consciousness, where I wasn't seeing visual images anymore, but where my consciousness was so wide open that I was able to take in vast amounts of information all at once, not linear, like we take things one and after the other. And suddenly it was like I no longer forgot, or I remembered all of my past lives. And oh yes, I could see how all my past lives fit together. And it was like the pictures of a jigsaw puzzle being put together so I could see the big picture, because I'd had hints of my past lives before then, but now it was all being put together. And I had like an aha experience, like, aha! You know, finally, my rather unusual life as Dr. Yvonne Kason made sense, why I was having all of these STEs throughout my life. Because guess what? This was not my first incarnation having STEs. And so my soul was sort of picking up where it left off from previous incarnations. Anyway, I basked in this realm where it felt like timeless time, because time passed differently over there. It felt like past, present, and future all sort of coexisted. We're all sort of there at the same time. It's very, very difficult to explain. But then after a period of timeless time, the two beings of light reappeared to me again, Paramahansa Yogananda and Mahavatar Babaji, and they mentally or telepathically communicated to me, you may now choose, which means you must now choose. And the choice was either to incarnate in the body of a baby to further serve the divine as a babe in that incarnation, and or to go back to the maimed form. And in the light, in the presence of these great saints, it was like my intellect was asleep or something, and that I was just functioning from my heart, because it literally felt like my heart responded as if the voice came out of my heart, which was just expanded and full of love. And my heart instantly responded, oh masters, please guide me. What is the higher choice? I want to do God's will. And they so lovingly, how a thought can be loving, but it was so lovingly, mentally, telepathically, the thought was sent back to me. It will be more difficult, but to return to the maimed body. And again, my intellect didn't ask questions or what would this involve or anything. It was like my intellect wasn't there. And my heart instantly responded, I accept. And faster than the speed of thought, it was between the thought I and the thought accept. So it was like, I accept. With a gasp of air, I woke up in my dead body that was lying on the ground, ice cold like an ice cube. And for the first few minutes when I was back in my body, breathing life back into my body, I could see both realms perfectly clear. I could see the physical world around me and the person that was nearby. Oh, Yvonne, are you okay? Are you okay? And I remember saying, no, that was my answer. But I could see the realm of light superimposed on the physical world. It was like they were superimposed on each other. And I could see the two saints who had brought me back to my body. And then slowly the white light realm started disappearing from my view, like that split screen TV again, until it just became a little dot of light, and then it was gone. And then I found myself back in my body, but I had a serious traumatic brain injury with a brain hemorrhage. And just because of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it disabled me. It disabled me from practicing medicine. I was no longer able to do the work that I used to do. I couldn't practice medicine. I couldn't write. I couldn't public speak. I couldn't volunteer in my son's school. I couldn't volunteer on any of the boards where I used to volunteer. I was disabled due to the traumatic brain injury. I went for neuro rehab for 7 years because I was so trying to get back to what I used to do. I loved it so much working with STE experiencers. But I had to accept after a period of time that it seemed in the divine plan that I was now to be a disabled person, and that how I would be able to serve was through my prayers and my meditation. So I focused very much, in addition to rehab, on my spiritual practice, on my prayer and meditation. And meditation was one of the abilities I lost with my brain injury. It took me years to get back my ability to meditate, but I was determined and I worked really, really hard at it. Anyway, so you might be wondering now, how is it that she's now the president of Spiritual Awakenings International, past president of IANS, written a new book, speaking today if she was permanently disabled? Well, I had another STE 12 years after my brain injury. On February 24th, 2016, while I was meditating in the meditation retreat, Self-Realization Fellowship Meditation Retreat in Encinitas, California, suddenly in the middle of my meditation, I had a spontaneous brain healing. And what happened was suddenly in the middle of my meditation, I had an inner experience like the lights came on, a volcano of light erupted in the center of my brain. And the sensation was that the center of my brain had been in darkness for the last 12 years since my brain injury. And literally, suddenly, the lights came on with this flow of liquid light. And the inner experience was like waking up. Like waking up after having been asleep for 12 years. And my brain was healed. In the first year following this healing, I wrote the first draft of my next 2 books. And my first book that I wrote since my brain healing, it's over my shoulder there. Oh, that shoulder touched by the light. And I just feel blessed by the divine that I was healed 12 years. What a miracle. And I wanted to share that because I wanted to say to everybody, don't ever give up on the possibility of healing. You just don't know when a miracle might happen that according to medical thinking, it should be impossible to have a spontaneous healing 12 years after a brain injury, but I did. And I had the very strong inner message at the time of my brain healing and afterwards, pass on what you have learned. And so that is what I'm doing now. Today, through my talk, through my books, through Spiritual Awakenings International, is passing on what I have learned. So now I'm going to share screen again, and I'm going to go through some of what I want to share with you today about spiritually transformative experiences. Now, spiritually transformative experiences, that is a phrase that I coined back in 1994 in one of my first book on STEs. And I coined this phrase because I noticed that this broad range of experiences that are all causing spiritual awakenings are all having very similar after effects. So I figured there must be some connection between these diverse experiences. And what are the types of STEs? I use the model very much drawn from yoga that I learned from Gopi Krishna, because I found actually as I was researching STEs that yoga had the best model that I was able to find to help me understand these. So there's mystical experiences, which in yoga are called samadhis, and I'll be talking more about all of these in a minute. Psychic or intuitive experiences, which in yoga are called siddhis. There are the spiritual energy, which in yoga is called Kundalini Awakenings. We have near-death experiences. We have other death-related STEs, and inspired creativity and genius. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about some of these definitions, because I have found over the years in my work with experiencers is that a really important healing piece for them is to find a name for their experience, an accurate name for their experience, rather than calling it a hallucination, you're imagining it, or you're crazy. And so once I go through these names, you might have the experience that many people do when I start talking about definitions of STEs, discover, gee, I had that. I didn't know that was that. I didn't know that that's the experience I had. Anyway, so first off, let me start with types of mystical experiences. I divide them into about 7 main categories. So the first category is the unitive or the communion type of mystical experience. So this is a mystical experience where people feel the oneness. They may feel the oneness in a smaller type. All of these can be from small to medium to large in terms of how grand they might be, expansive. So a smaller, perhaps unitive experience might be a feeling of oneness with your lover, or with a close friend, or feeling of oneness with a tree, or with a scene in nature where it's like your boundaries are gone and you feel one with the scene in nature. Another much more profound unitive experience is a feeling of oneness with the higher power, with the cosmos, with the power behind the universe. Second time or a type of mystical experiences are the ecstatic episodes or bliss episodes. And these are mystical experiences where the most profound or marked feature is the joy, the bliss, the ecstasy. And you'll sometimes see pictures of saints and their faces are just radiating joy, and they've got tears of joy streaming down their cheeks. So this would be an ecstatic or bliss type of mystical experience. Then there are mystical visions. So had it not been in the near-death experience, when I saw Yogananda and Babaji in their light bodies, that would have been a mystical vision. So this is a visual experience of that is elevating, like all mystical experiences, but it has a strong visual component. And often people will see saints. They might see masters from their own spiritual tradition. They might see angels. They might sometimes see teachers from other spiritual traditions. So these are mystical visions that have a strong visual component. Then there are expansive episodes. Mystical expansive episodes is when it feels like your consciousness is no longer the size of your head, but it's expanded. And sometimes it expands several feet beyond your head. Sometimes it might expand to your whole planet. Sometimes you might feel you expand to the whole universe. Then we have the spiritual rebirth, conversion, or purification type of mystical experience. And this is like in the Christian tradition, they have John on the road to Damascus. Oops, somebody who's making noise, please mute yourself. John on the road to Damascus, where he has a white light experience and he has a complete conversion of faith. This can happen to other people too, and it happens to people even to this day, that they have a complete conversion from an atheist or an agnostic to a person with a profound, powerful faith based on their mystical experience. Then there can be mystical experiences that are revelations or illumination, or prophecy would also fit into this. And these are mystical experiences that have a large amount of information, a large amount of knowledge with them. That the most prominent feature of the mystical experience is the new knowledge that was conveyed at the time of the experience. And then the last type of mystical experience is what I call dissolution experiences. This would be when a person's sense of self completely dissolves. There's no sense of self anymore, and they dissolve into the infinite. These are very, very difficult to describe. The next type of STE I want to talk to you about briefly is the spiritual energy, or what in yoga is called the Kundalini Awakening. Now, if you look in the mystical traditions of all the world's great faiths, you'll find that they pretty well, all of them refer to some sort of spiritual energy, although they might use different words in their particular tradition. And that might be like in the Jewish tradition, Kabbalah, I've heard it's called Shekinah, sometimes called Holy Spirit, sometimes called Holy Wind. In Dumo, in Tibetan Buddhism, it can be called Dumo. So in different traditions, there are different words for a spiritual energy, which can sometimes become activated. And in yoga, this is called the Kundalini Awakening. And what are the classic symptoms if one has a spiritual energy or Kundalini Awakening? And they're threefold. Number one is there's a movement of energy, that there's this a physical sensation of energy moving in the body. And often the feeling of energy is rushing up the spine, although it can be rushing up the whole body. Sometimes people have it coming up their arms and legs before it goes up their whole body, but definite sensations of energy movement. And then this is also usually associated with a strong inner sound. And the inner sound can be variously described as a roaring sound, a rushing sound, a blowing sound, or a ringing. And sometimes you read people talk, having a Kundalini or spiritual energy awakening, they'll say that the holy wind blew through them. So this gives you both the concept of the energy movement of the wind, but also the sound of the blowing that happens with the spiritual energy awakening. And then many people will have a light perception, not always, but some will see inner lights moving in their body. They might experience that the world around them becomes more luminous. They might experience themselves as becoming radiant with light. And at the end of this, it typically leads to either immediately or sometimes delayed, a mystical, a psychic, or a creative experience. Now, Kundalini Awakening is an awakening. It's a beginning. It's understood in the traditions, all of the mystical traditions really, that after the first experience that one continues to have repeated experiences of the Kundalini, of the spiritual energy, which leads to repeated ongoing transformation of consciousness. So the next group of STEs are the psychic or intuitive experiences. Now there are so many of them. I'm just going to list a few here so you'll be familiar what some of them are. Automatic writing. This is when a person, sometimes it can be where it feels like a force other than the individual takes over the hand and starts writing, and the person doesn't even know what's going to be written down, but their hand starts writing something. That's one form of automatic writing. Another form of automatic writing is that the experiencer is hearing the thoughts in their own mind or knowing the thoughts and then writing it down as if someone is dictating to them what they are to write down. So that is automatic writing. Channeling, this is a psychic phenomenon where it seems that the personality of the individual steps aside and another personality, which is not embodied currently, is speaking using the instrument of that body to speak. And normally a channeler has no recollection of what was being spoken through their body by this other entity while they are channeling. Clairvoyance. This is a psychic phenomenon where, as I talked about what I had the experience where I saw my friend's brain covered in pus, where you get a visual image where you see something that is beyond the normal range of sight. So that would be clairvoyance. Clairsentience is when you can feel or know something that you wouldn't otherwise feel or know. And so one way clairsentience manifests, and many people have this after their spiritual awakening, is that they start picking up on other people's emotions and feelings because they can feel it as physical sensations in their own body. Physically, they can feel it. Another form of clairsentience is many people can sense where illnesses are on another person or even onto another animal. They just know it without any reason that they would know that. This is clairsentience. Clairaudience, this is where you get information, you can hear information that you would not normally be able to hear, such as being able to hear spirit guides, sometimes being able to hear things that are happening at faraway distances from you. Healing abilities, that's a psychic or intuitive ability that some people develop, and that can be, again, in two different ways. I've seen it manifested. Sometimes it's sort of a laying on of hands ability where people can lay on their hands and have a healing influence on the person they're laying on their hands. Other people find that just being in their presence, that people who come into their presence that are close to their aura or energy field find themselves healed. And there are other people with healing abilities I have heard about who are actually even able to do it remotely, that they over a distance can pray and project their healing to another person who's requesting healing. And the next one is higher guidance, ability to communicate with spirit guides. This is very, very, very common that people, as part of their spiritual awakening, start being able to receive higher guidance, to receive communication from their spirit guides. Mediumship. Now, mediumship is different from channeling. What mediumship is the psychic or intuitive ability where a person is able to communicate with beings that seem to be no longer in their physical form, deceased beings, by either seeing them and or hearing them. And you can have a two-way conversation in mediumship. And the medium is very aware of what's going on in this communication. And then out-of-body experiences, which I think all of you know, where the point of perception seems to leave the physical body, and it could be around where the physical body is, or sometimes it can go to other locations. Some more types of psychic intuitive experiences. We have materialization, which is quite well documented, that some very advanced adepts are able to materialize things. A dematerialization is another phenomenon. Premonitions and precognition. This is the ability to know things before they occur. It becomes much more common in persons once they've had their spiritual awakening. Past life recall. This is one that many people start having at some point after their spiritual awakening. And in my experience, past life recall is often triggered by one of two things. That sometimes it's triggered by meeting a person that you realize, oh my goodness, I have had a past life with this person. That meeting a person that it seems you've had a past life with triggers you to start remembering that past life. Another trigger many people have told me about is about going to a physical location on the planet, a place on the planet, and suddenly starting to have memories that, oh my goodness, it appears I've had a past life incarnation in this particular physical location. Now here I'm talking about past life memories that come up spontaneously. And all of these that come up spontaneously, I'm not talking now in this talk about people who are doing techniques to try and develop this ability or doing this under hypnosis or under regression. This is spontaneous past life recall is what I'm talking about. Telekinesis, this is another psychic experience where people are able to move objects through the force of their mind. And sometimes this happens involuntarily. I mean, it's happened to me. Once I was very stressed. I was going to speak to a hostile audience and I was preparing in the room right next to it. And the coffee mug that was sitting on the table beside me moved about 2 feet across the table and then fell onto the floor. And I realized that it was probably my own energy because I was feeling very tense and I was probably putting out some tense energy that made the object move. Telepathy, this is the experience of being able to mentally communicate without the use of words. Telepyrokinesis, this is the ability some people develop of being able to start a fire with the ability of the mind. And then the last one I'll mention today, the last two, are transdimensional experiences where people seem to communicate or even cross over into other dimensions. And it is my assessment, it is my clinical experience in working with people that some UFO experiences are actually trans-dimensional experiences. And this is particularly true of the abduction type of experiences. It seems as if these aliens are on some other dimension, or these entities, I call them that, we call them aliens here on Earth, and that they're able to perhaps take us over transdimensionally to their dimension, which is perceived as an abduction, or it might feel they're coming into your bedroom from another, while you're sleeping at night, from another dimension. So these are transdimensional. This is not the same as the UFO sightings, when people see an unidentified flying object in the sky, physically in our dimension. This is a different type of UFO encounter. Now, I want to mention here that psychic experiences are not always spiritual or positive, that sometimes they can be quite distressing as compared to mystical experiences and Kundalini experiences, which are generally quite positive overall and uplifting. That psychic experiences can be frightening or intrusive, and examples would be excessive clairvoyance, excessive clairaudience, excessive clairsentience. There are instances of psychic assault where people feel that someone with a very advanced psychic abilities but who's not very ethical is assaulting or intruding on them. Possession states, which is very rare. Then we have the negative or the frightening NDEs, which some of them may be due to accessing lower astral planes, and the phenomenon of the walk-in. Just because of time today, I'm not going to go into that anymore. The next category of STE is inspired creativity and genius. And this type of STE is that there's a group of people who have STEs, which are powerful, inspired creative experiences that are mixed together with a mystical experience. And there are examples through history, if we look at some of the great mystics in history who've also had tremendous inspired creativity and produced works that are far beyond what one would expect from the amount of schooling that these individuals had. And two mystics that leap to mind like this, one would be Hildegard of Bingen, the Christian mystic, and Paramahansa Yogananda, who wrote 17 books. And also the reciprocal way is that there are some people that are known for their genius that also had mystical experiences, which is again showing the connection between mystical experience and genius. And so examples of geniuses who had mystical experiences would include Einstein and Brahms. Now the near-death experience. So what is a near-death experience? A near-death experience is an out-of-body and or white light mystical experience. And it happens when a person is close to death or clinically dead, or if they're facing imminent death or severe trauma, meaning they think they're about to die or they're about to be severely traumatized. Now you have to have both in order for it to be a near-death experience. So if you're sitting in your living room and you have an out-of-body experience and you're at no risk of any harm coming to yourself, that is not a near-death experience, it's an out-of-body experience. And similar, if you have a mystical experience, which perhaps is very similar in appearance to a near-death experience, but it happens to you when you're sitting overlooking the ocean or something where there's no risk of harm, it's a mystical experience. But if it happens when you're close to death or facing death, or clinically dead, or facing trauma, then we call it a near-death experience. There are a lot of people today who are making mistakes, and I'm saying the general press and in the public, and they're calling any close call. So any time that they were close to death, like I remember reading an article about somebody who was surfing in the Pacific and a shark came and took a bite out of their surfboard, and they came to shore and they go, wow, I had a near-death experience. And so the headline in the paper was, you know, surfer has near-death experience. But when you read the story, well, a bite was taken out of his surfboard. There was nothing about going out of body. There was nothing about having a white light mystical experience during the time. So it was a close call. It was a brush with death. But it's not a near-death experience unless while at that time, you also have an out-of-body and or white light mystical experience. And NDEs have been reported for centuries. I mean, the term was coined by Dr. Raymond Moody back in the 1970s. But here's a painting from the 1500s that sure looks a lot like going up a tunnel towards the light in the near-death experience. And in the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Egyptian Book of the Dead, there are many descriptions which are very similar to near-death experiences. So the term we're using is new, but the phenomenon has been described for centuries. Now, the frequency of near-death experiences, I included this because I found this very interesting. Dr. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist, did an excellent study, which was published in The Lancet, which is a very highly reputable medical journal. And his study, he was studying patients in the cardiology unit who were having all of these cardiac procedures, and they were all monitored, all wired up. And so they could very clearly tell if somebody was dead or not, that if they flatlined for a length of period of time, that clearly their heart had stopped. And I believe they also had EEG electrodes on so they'd know if the brain had stopped. And what he found was that only 1 in 8 of the patients who were clinically dead, documented as clinically dead for a period of time, reported a near-death experience, the out-of-body or mystical experience, which means 7 out of 8 don't, which is very interesting. And what are the circumstances that one can have an NDE? just about anything you can think of. People have remembered having been in the womb before they were born, during childbirth, if they were born and their mother had a very difficult delivery, you know, in the incubator, as neonates, at any time in their life due to cardiac arrest, complications from surgery, near drowning, severe illnesses with a high fever, you know, accidents, car accidents, plane accidents, train accidents, near-miss accidents, electrocution, being hit by lightning, allergic reactions, hypoglycemic reactions, facing death in combat, and facing severe abuse or trauma. And there are basically 3 types of near-death experiences. One is the out-of-body type, and there are a number of people that is their entire near-death experience, where they go out of body and they're accurately observing what's happening around their body or sometimes in adjacent rooms. Then there's the second type, which in the field we call it the deeper near-death experience, which in addition to the out-of-body, they then go into the mystical experience. They may have a life review, they may go through a tunnel, but they end up in the white light realm in the presence of what they feel is a higher power. They may meet beings of light, they may meet deceased spirits in the mystical white light NDE. Then there is a third type, which is a distressing NDE, and I wanted to bring that to your attention. And in my experience, there are basically 3 types of distressing NDEs. One is people who actually are not having anything awful happening in their NDE, but they're fighting it, that they realize as they're floating out of their body and going towards the light, they don't want to die. So they're fighting with all of their might to get into the body. And people have described me that the sensation is very distressing. It's like trying to swim against an undertow. The pull to get out of the body is so strong that it causes them a lot of stress, fighting to try and get into their body. Then the second type of distressing NDE that I've heard people tell me about is the ones that I think I would call in the yogic tradition the low astral NDE. Like if you think of the ocean, and the ocean has many, many layers, we know that. And the layers that are closer to the bottom are very dark and very dense. And then you have in between layers. And then up near the top, you have lighter layers and where more light comes through. So if you think of this, when we leave our body and we go into the astral, that there are also many astral planes that we want to go up into the light-filled astral heavens, but sometimes we might go out to a medium level or even one of these lower, darker levels. And people describe frightening experiences where it seems that they've gone into a lower astral plane. But good to know, there are case stories. I mentioned one in my book, Pastor Howard Storm, where it is possible that if you start off with a frightening, low astral, dark type of NDE, if you turn to spirit and start praying, it can be converted into a white light NDE. He was lifted up and brought into the white light realm. And then there's this third category. I call them nightmare-like distortions. People describe like weird patterns and convoluted stories that don't make sense. And I wonder if these might be related to drugs or toxins that are in their body when they're having their crisis that's giving them these distortions. And then there's a final distressed NDE type. And these are some NDEers are very distressed or angry, not because their NDE was negative. In fact, their NDE was beautiful. They're angry that they were sent back. It's so much nicer on the other side. They wish that they could have stayed on the other side. So just to be aware, not everybody has a positive experience with a near-death experience. Then we have our other death-related STEs, and there are 3 main types. We have the first one happens to people shortly before they die. This is the deathbed visions, nearing death awareness, end of life experiences. And these can happen to people hours, days, or sometimes up to a couple weeks before they die. And they generally, it's like the veils between this side and the other side become permeable. They often will start seeing and being able to communicate with spirits of deceased loved ones, maybe their husband or their parent, or sometimes a spiritual master from their faith. And often people who have these experiences and the healthcare providers around them sense that this means the person's going to be dying soon. Usually the person may sort of tell their family member they're no longer afraid of dying, they're ready to die, and that there's a role reversal. They're now comforting their loved ones that don't grieve for me, I'm going to be fine, I'm ready to die. So this is the one category of other death-related STE, the deathbed experiences. Then there is the Deathwatch or shared death experience that happens exactly at the moment that somebody else dies. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. And then the third category is the after-death communications. And this happens days to weeks to months, sometimes years after somebody dies. And it seems that that spirit is trying to communicate with the person who is still in form. Now, the Deathwatch experience, again, this is the one that happens right at the time that somebody else dies. I coined this phrase back in the late 90s because I found it was very, very common and there was no other name for it at that time. And a Deathwatch experience is much more common if you are physically close to somebody when they die. So if you're right at their bedside or holding their hand, that would be, you're more likely to have a Deathwatch experience at their moment of death. It's also more likely to happen if you're emotionally close to the person who dies, if it's somebody that you love and somebody who loves you. And then this could happen whether you're close to them physically or you're miles away from them, either the other end of the planet. It's also more common if you're receptive to STEs, you've already had a spiritual awakening. The types of Deathwatch experiences, I want to share you a bit because there are many types. There are some that are NDE-like, and I call these the shared death experience. So this would be at the moment of your loved one's death, where you might find yourself suddenly out of body and you feel yourself and your loved one together going up the tunnel towards the light, and you can see the light that you're both heading towards, and then suddenly you stop and your loved one continues going up into the light, and then you find yourself back in your body. So this is a true sharing and the crossing over, the NDE-like Deathwatch experience. Then there is the body symptom Deathwatch experience some people have described, where at the moment of death of their loved one, that they get the physical symptoms in their body that their loved one was having at their time of death. One woman told me she was in Toronto washing dishes and she suddenly got crushing chest pain and was really short of breath. She wondered if she was having a heart attack, and all of a sudden her image of her father came into her mind's eye and the chest pain went away, and she said, "Oh my goodness, I wonder if my dad has had a heart attack." And sure enough, she got a phone call a few minutes later that approximately at the time she had those symptoms, her father, who was holidaying in Europe, had collapsed and died of a massive heart attack. Deathwatch visions, this is another type of Deathwatch experience, but it's visionary. And this happens to many people, and I would say this is probably one of the most common ones. And it can be many, many forms. Sometimes if you're sitting at your loved one's bedside, you might see a wisp of light as their spirit is leaving the body as they are deceased. Some people see an orb of light, like a ball of light, leaving their loved one's body at their moment of death. There are other people who've seen like an angel standing at their loved one's bedside, waiting for the loved one to pass, and then the angel and their loved one's spirit leave together. Other times people can be at a remote distance. And this happened to me, for example, with my grandfather. I was sleeping here in Toronto when my grandfather died. I did not know he was ill. I did not know he was in the hospital. He was in Switzerland. And all of a sudden, I've had an image appear in my mind. Visually, I could see my grandfather's face. And he was radiating light and he looked young. And I thought this was very odd because I'd never known my grandfather young. To me, my grandfather was always old. But I woke up from my sleep and I thought, oh my goodness, I think Grandpa has died. And sure enough, I got a phone call several minutes later that my grandfather had died in Europe. So this was a visual experience. Other people have told me at the moment of death, they've seen the image of the person appear in a mirror. One fellow told me he was driving to visit his mom in the hospital. He was hoping to get there. He knew she was in critical condition. And all of a sudden, the rearview mirror, he could see his mother's face, clear as could be. And he just knew intuitively that his mother had died, and that was correct. So these are various forms of Deathwatch visions. Then there are auditory Deathwatch experiences. And this is where you can hear the voice of the departed loved one at their moment of death. And I actually have heard this from a first responder who was at the roadside at a crash accident, a soul that had just deceased, and he could hear it communicating with him. "I'm confused, what am I supposed to do?" And he mentally communicated with this soul, "Look for a light, go to the light," which it did. The next kind is, I call it the brushed by an angel or the mystical Deathwatch experience. And this is, there's sometimes when people are sitting at the bedside of a loved one who's dying, they feel like maybe an angel that came to accompany them brushed their energy field, and they were catapulted into a mystical experience at the moment of death of their loved one. And I have seen this happen more frequently if you have the great honor and privilege of being at the bedside of a saint at their moment of death. That often many people in the room of a saint at the moment of death will say that they experience this kind of brushed by an angel experience at their moment of death. And then the final type I wanted to tell you about was about the ushering Deathwatch experience. And this is where people suddenly find themselves popped out of body with a spirit beside them of a deceased person who seems to be confused and not knowing what to do. And they know intuitively that they're being called to help that spirit find their way over to the light. So that now ends what I'm going to say about spiritually transformative experiences. So now I'm going to wrap into our conclusion, and then we're going to be starting with question and answers for those of you who have questions. So after the spiritual awakening, many people become multiple STE experiencers. And this has been what I've observed in my clinical work in the last 40 years, that it's very rare to have only one STE. What happens to most people is they start having more STEs, and it's not necessarily of the same type. So they start having many types of STEs repeatedly so that this becomes a part of their life. And I want to point out here that there can be sometimes very challenging after effects from STEs. We don't have time today to go into the after effects, but I do want to mention some challenges that sometimes people have difficulties with relationships after their STE because they've changed, but their partner hasn't. So this can be very challenging for some people. Some people feel confusion, anxiety, particularly if they have not yet found a word to accurately label their experience without calling it crazy or a hallucination. Many people fear that they'll be labeled crazy if they tell people, so they're afraid to talk about it. Some people even fear that they are crazy, that they themselves are interpreting their experience. This must be a sign that I'm going crazy. Some people have challenges because they're fixated with the experience. They want to think about it all the time or talk about it all the time, which interferes with their life. Some people have challenges because, as I said before, they feel anger or despair that they're no longer having the bliss joy they had while in their STE. And many people have surfacing of traumatic issues as part of the house cleaning, inner house cleaning that happens after an STE. And sometimes this recall of traumatic issues can be very challenging too. So how can we, people within the Spiritual Awakenings International, how can we support STE experiencers? Well, I have found in my experience, it's very basic that we need to listen. We need to listen to each other. Listen. People want to be able to share their story and be listened to supportively. Secondly, we can validate it for them. This is real. This is very real to the person telling you. Even if you've never even heard of this type of an event, and you have to look it up on our website. Have you ever heard of something like this? It's real to the person. So validate for them. It is very real to them. Thirdly, we can help educate experiencers. We can help give them names for their STEs, like some of the names that I presented in my talk today. And these names are all on our website, so you can refer to them afterwards. That it's incredibly helpful to people to get a non-pathological name to call their experience. And you could suggest to them the STE websites like our Spiritual Awakenings International website, books that are about STEs or support groups that are relating to STEs. And if they really need some professional support, try to help them find some professional support givers who are knowledgeable about STEs. So I want to end with finding our way home. You know, many people after the spiritual awakening, they feel like they're in a fog, right? You know, the world is so dark and so confused. It's like I'm this little ship out in the fog. I'm looking for a lighthouse on the shore to help me find my way home. So what are some of the things that I have found in 40 years of research that is going to help STE experiencers find their way home? And these are the keys that will help anyone have a healthy spiritual awakening and find their way home. Number one, live a balanced lifestyle in body, mind, and spirit. You have to pay attention to every part of your life, not just the spiritual. Body, mind, and spirit need to be healthy. Strive for self-development, self-improvement. If you have some issues that you need to go into recovery or psychotherapy, embrace that. Do your inner work. Thirdly, lead an honest, ethical life. Try to live by the spiritual ethical guidelines that the great faiths have given us, like the Golden Rule, the 10 Commandments, the 8 limbs of yoga. Strive to lead your life in this honest, ethical way. Strive to be of service to others, to be more loving, to be more compassionate, to be less selfish, to think of the world community as our greater self, as our spiritual brothers and sisters. And finally, to meditate and pray daily to spiritually deepen. And that meditation is the key to finding your way home, to our ultimate goal, which is an ongoing process of spiritual communion, of spiritual oneness. So if you want to know more, that's a copy of my book, Touched by the Light, or you can look at our Spiritual Awakenings International website, where much of the information that I've talked about today, I have posted on the website there. So with that, I am going to stop, and Linda is going to take over. And okay, but Francis,
if you could, I will give you the first question. 2003, when you had that traumatic head trauma, how extensive was that disability as far as self-care? Were you able to take care of yourself during those 12 years?
It was variable, Linda. Thanks for the question. After the traumatic brain injury, most of my disability was cognitive impairments because of where the injury was in my brain. It was not affecting my ability to walk or my ability to talk or my ability to feed myself. But I had very serious cognitive impairments, like short-term memory was so severely impacted that I had difficulty taking a shower because I couldn't remember if I had washed my hair yet or not, if I put the conditioner on or not. That was how severely my short-term memory was impacted. So it was hugely impacted. But then I had some other medical issues later on. I had to have some surgery. And because I just had the brain, it was gynecological surgery, not brain surgery. But because of my brain injury, I reacted very, very badly to the anesthesias and to the drugs that I was given. And I then became so weak that I actually did need home care. I needed to have someone coming into the house to help me with bathing, with grooming, my self-care tasks. I had friends that were cooking meals for me because I was unable to cook. I had, I just realized I should have put the focus back on myself. I had friends that needed to cook for me because I was unable to cook. I had friends that were doing my shopping for me because I was unable to drive. So there was a period of time where I needed a lot of support. But most of the impairment was cognitive rather than physical.
Well, I'm glad you're back with us.
Thank you.
All right, we do have another participant, and that is Francis Liu. Francis, I unmuted you. You should be able to speak.
Yes, Yvonne, Francis here.
Hello, Francis.
Oh, yeah, and I'm so glad to hear your wonderful, wonderful talk. The virtual background here is Esalen Institute, Big Sur, California, where I have
wonderful.
where I have led or co-led 36 film seminars since 1987, and I will post in the chat box some Amazon lists of materials that people might find of interest related to your talk.
Thank you.
I really appreciate your creating this wonderful organization and to further the work that you've spoken about. And I know you mentioned my being placed on your wall of honor, and I'm very appreciative of that, very grateful of that. And just to mention that in 1994, David Lukoff, myself, and Robert Turner sent in a proposal to the American Psychiatric Association, which led to, in 1994, the religious or spiritual problem category in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 4th edition. And very clearly it says that this is not a mental disorder, these conditions, but rather distressing experiences that people have, but not psychopathology, not a hallucination. And it provides a psychiatric category that can be used to crosswalk with all of the experiences that you've spoken about here. Well, not all of them, but the ones that are particularly distressing. And I think that's a very important piece to remember, is that a number of the experiences can be distressing. And am I going crazy and all of that? And here you do have a non-pathological category to use to communicate with others that as opposed to a mental disorder. And so, yeah, happy to let people know about that on the call here today, and happy to leave some materials on the chat box.
Well, thank you, Francis. Do you have a question for me at all?
No, just congratulations and thank you. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Francis. I'm really glad you could make it. And thank you for your pioneering work. That meant the world to me. I'm just going to share something since we don't have too many questions backed up. I didn't talk about the hurdles that I had to go through when I launched the Spiritual Emergence Research and Referral Clinic in Toronto, because this was really breaking new ground. And oh yeah, I had to deal with the medical establishment with this. I had to deal with our licensing body. I had to deal with our malpractice insurance provider. And so the time that they were challenging me, really challenging me, was 1993. Like basically they were saying what I was doing was outside of the parameter of medicine, that I would, basically either have to stop doing it or lose my license. And I was uninsurable because what I was doing was outside the practice of medicine. And of course, as a medical doctor, the way it is in Canada, I presume it is the same in the United States. If you're not insured, you cannot practice. You have to have malpractice insurance to be able to practice. So these were very serious hurdles that I had to get through. But in 1993, I met your colleague, Robert Turner. And I met him at a Kundalini Research Network conference. And Robert Turner told me about you, Francis, and him and David Lukoff working on this submission, and that it had just been accepted. So, through the grace of God, I had learned that it was going to be in the DSM-4 before the DSM-4 came out. So when I got challenged by this is how I look at my guardian angels helped me. So when I was challenged by the medical profession, I was able to use your work, Francis, that you did with Robert Turner and David Lukoff. And I was, Robert gave me a copy of the article or submission or something. And I was able to give this to the licensing body, and I was able to give it to my malpractice insurer. And so I was able to pitch it this way, saying, this is a newly recognized area which does fit into the practice of medicine, so much so that it has just been accepted by the American Psychiatric Association. It's going to be in the DSM-4. And I am actually doing our public a service, because I am the very first doctor in Canada specializing in this area. And so, believe it or not, yeah. Thank you, Francis. You played a part in me being able to do the work that I did. So thank you for that.
All right, we do have another question, and this is Karen Bates. Just a moment. Okay, I just unmuted you. There you go, Karen. You should be
Hi.
able to speak.
Okay. Hi, Yvonne.
Hi, Karen.
That was great.
Thank you.
That was really a good presentation, and I'm been so interested in all of this for so long. The question is twofold. When you were talking about the 3 types of distressing NDEs, do you think that the people that experience the distressing, well, basically the people that are sitting here watching this with you are not the kind of people that would experience the distressing type of NDE because they're more on a spiritual journey and they're at a different place than people that would experience low astral dark entities. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I'd have to answer that as we really don't know. Because I have heard some cases of some very spiritual people who've had distressing NDEs. And so it's complicated. And that's why I also postulated that hallucination distortion one, if it actually has to do with toxins that are in the body and the brain that sometimes might make a person who is very spiritual have something that's sort of distorted and convoluted and very unpleasant. I actually had one person tell me he's had 2 near-death experiences. This fellow, he told me this about 2 years ago. And his first near-death experience, I can't remember how many years ago it was, but it was a beautiful one. He went out of body, he saw what was happening around his body, then he went into the light, and he had a beautiful near-death experience, which changed him completely in a positive way, changed his life. He's very spiritual. Then he had another near-death experience many years later. So the one he had many years later was distressing. And he told me about it. And it was like a nightmare with this bizarre plot, and people's faces were changing shape and all sorts of weird stuff was happening. And his interpretation of it was, well, I guess for whatever reason, I needed a positive experience first, and then this other one, because of some reason, the higher power knows that I don't understand, but I've just come to accept it. So I'm just sharing that with you because I think it's not as linear as we think. And it's not that good people have positive near-death experiences and people who aren't spiritual have negative. It's more complicated than that. Mm-hmm.
You know, I used to watch a show, and it's not on anymore. It was I Survived Beyond and Back.
Really?
And
Robert Fair was on that show.
It was amazing. And so there are 3 different episodes within the one show. And of the entire series, only twice did they have someone experience the dark side. And so I always wondered, why is that? Everybody else experienced like the light and everything that you spoke of. And there were 2 people that had the dark entity nightmare type of experience. And I never knew why that was.
Well, you know, I think too that there's probably 2 things happening. I think people are more reluctant to talk about their distressing NDEs. It's uncomfortable. They might think people are going to judge them or whatever. So I think that's part of the reason that you don't hear about it as much. And I think secondly, maybe because it's not as interesting television, you know, they want to have the positive stories. So maybe a combination of those things. So you said you had a second question? Yeah, go ahead.
I do. But this is just, if you have someone that you really want to see this presentation, you said they can go on the website and there will be a video there to be able to see this? Is that what you said?
Yes. What we are doing is we're recording this right now, and after we've edited it, etc., it will be posted on the website so that everybody will be able to go to our Spiritual Awakenings International website and they can watch it.
And we should just go on there and just check on there to see how long it takes to get it up.
Yeah, well, this is our first one, so this is all a new process for us. So I cannot yet tell you how long it's going to take us to figure out the techie stuff. So, but we should have it up within the next week or 2. So.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Does anyone else have a question? please go down to your participants box and press raise hand if you have a question. Oh, we have Kamla.
Did I see somebody wave their hand just
So
now?
Kamla has a question. Kamla?
Okay. Just a moment. She is now unmuted. Oh, she should be unmuted.
Kamla, can you try to unmute yourself?
Let me see.
Okay,
Hi there.
Hi there, Kamla.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question about when you're looking at the vast, many types of, I'm sorry, my camera is really fuzzy.
Oh, don't worry about it.
So when you're looking at the vast, many different types of these experiences, and I understand there are certain categories, I'm hearing the dark experiences. My experience has been that there's like a light void type experience and a dark void type experience and a rainbow void type experience, which seem to correspond with like an upper mid-world and lower world type shamanic type tri-world view.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering if, like, I know A.H. Almas talks about dark void and light void type initiations, and other teachers and traditions talk about that kind of, lens of a tri-world view. I was just wondering if you've ever kind of encountered that, and or with the dark world, dark void and or lower world type experiences that people feel uncomfortable. I thought it was very interesting that you were saying if you pray and you invoke the light, then you can actually kind of transmute that. That has absolutely been my experience without a doubt. And I know Barbara Ann Brennan has written of that as well. So I was just wondering if, like, when tracking these types of experiences, if there's like a body of work with suggestions for people to be able to navigate the more challenging ones like that.
Mm-hmm. Wow, thank you for your question, Kamla. Well, trying to get the spotlight back on me. There we go. Thank you for your question, Kamla. I'm not an expert in that particular model that you were describing, the shamanic model of the light void, the dark void, and the rainbow void in between. If you go to different mystical or esoteric traditions, they're often talking about very parallel things, but using a different vocabulary. So the vocabulary that I have found most helpful, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the yogic vocabulary, where they talk about the astral planes and the level in the astral planes. And I was using the example of the ocean and the levels in the ocean. Another metaphor that people might relate to is there used to be a drink, I think it was called the B-52 or something, with all these different liqueurs, and the light liqueurs would float on top. There'd be these layers, and the heavier liqueurs would be at the bottom. That there's an understanding both in yoga and Buddhism that it's like that when you get out of our body and into the astral planes, that there are all these different levels. And it's not that a level is good or a level is bad. It's that everybody is, all entities are at a different place in their soul evolution. That is how I've come to understand it. And we may all start off in areas down in very dark areas and evolve over many, many lifetimes to gravitate to higher areas. So I don't have a simple answer for that, Kamla. In terms of guidelines for people, I think that the various faith traditions, whatever particular path somebody feels drawn to in their heart, I don't wish to impose my particular faith tradition on someone else if they're following a different faith path. But the various faith traditions often have guidance about this, about turning to the light, turning to the higher power, focusing your consciousness on the higher power, focusing on love, that those vibrations will tend to make you rise up the chakras or rise up the astral planes. So, and to not experiment with trying to access the lower planes. So this is an error that I've seen many people do when they're particularly early in a spiritual awakening. They think, oh, there's all these planes out there, let's explore all of them. You know, that's sort of like somebody going into New York City and going, oh, there's all kinds of neighborhoods here, good ones, medium ones, and bad ones. Let's explore all of them. So, you know, you don't want to be trying to go into the neighborhoods that are trouble. So that's another thing, to not be consciously trying to get into these planes. And some people get into crises. I didn't talk today about spiritual emergencies. Dr. Francis Liu referred to it very briefly. Dr. Emma Bragdon, who's also here, is quite an expert on spiritual emergencies. And yeah, that some people do get into spiritual emergencies relating to their spiritual awakening process. Sometimes it's because they're having some of these distressing experiences or lower astral plane experiences. And other times it's related to other factors, but that's another day, another talk. But my main guidelines for people I had on my last slide, which was, I'm going to pull it up again. Because you asked the question, I'm just going to pull that slide up again. Right. That I think very general, without you know, limiting to one particular path that you might be following. Living a balanced lifestyle is so important. Looking after your body, looking after your mind, and looking after your spiritual development. And striving for self-development, doing your inner work. A lot of people think, now that I've had a spiritual awakening, it's called a spiritual short circuit. They're just going to focus on spirituality and they're not doing any of their inner work. They're not dealing with any of their shadow issues. And that can be a really dangerous way that people are being caught into distressing experiences, is if they're not doing their inner work, they're not doing their recovery work, they're not doing their self-development. The third one, living a life based on spiritual principles, ethical principles, like the golden rule, the 10 commandments, the 8 limbs of yoga. All of these are important. It's like our spiritual masters have told us, if you live this way, this will help your spiritual transformation move in a positive direction. Being of service to others, being more giving, more loving, and all of these things make a difference. And then the meditation and prayer. And so here I'm going to make a point about meditation to answer your question, Kamala, too, is that the yogis warn about what meditation technique that you are practicing. That they say never to open yourself in meditation to anyone and anything that might want to come into me. That no, 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 no. Because again, it's like going into New York City and saying, anybody from any neighborhood, anywhere, no matter what your motivation, you're welcome to come into my car. No, that is a big mistake. So we should be focusing in our meditation on going as high as we can to the light. We should be focusing on the higher power, on the saints, on the light, on our top chakras, on the, you know, whatever your particular path, whatever the words are for the saints and spiritual leaders. By keeping our focus there and our intentionality there when we're meditating, will tend to keep us from going off into some of these lower astral planes. I'm not saying it's 100%, but it definitely makes a big difference. And the other thing I want to mention here is prayer, that we can also ask for help on the spiritual plane, that we can pray for help, that if we find ourselves, you know, in some distressing astral plane, we can pray to the spiritual masters of our particular path to help us. We can pray to God for help. And the person I was telling you about, Pastor Howard Storm, that when he was an atheist, he didn't believe in God, and he thought the religion was all crap when he went into his very distressing near-death experience. experience, but the intuition kept coming to him that he should pray. And he was being tormented, and these dark entities. It was really a nasty experience, but he didn't know how to pray. He'd been an atheist and agnostic for so long, he didn't even know how to pray. And the only thing he could think of was, he remembered a song he had learned as a kid. He remembered a few of the lines, not the rest. The song was called Jesus Loves Me, This I Know. So he started singing this song, Jesus loves me, this I know, making up words for the parts that he didn't know. And that was enough. He was turning his consciousness towards the light, and his prayer was answered. That he said, like a beam of light came down, and it seemed to envelop him and grab him and lift him up out of the darkness up into the light. So meditation and prayer, I think, are keys. And maybe one day we'll have somebody else as a speaker who can talk more about ways to try and prevent some of these negative experiences. But that's what I'd like to share for today, Kamala. Did that answer your question?
I was wondering if I could actually add to it. Sure. Then, yeah, I really appreciate everything that you shared. I just wanted to say I've followed your work since the 90s. Many members of my family have actually seen you, and
how wonderful.
I also studied with Jeanette McCullough, who who was the chair of the Spirituality and Healthcare Network that you started until she passed away. Yes. And so I guess what I wanted to suggest is that over the years, my experiences have often been with the dark void, and they've been somewhat challenging, but mostly not destabilizing. And in the last few years, I feel like I've started to make some headway in terms of figuring out what it is that I'm doing that makes it a positive experience, more like how the teacher age, Almas talks about it being deep and enriching, which I believe it is, like a womb state that is luminous unto itself. It may be with invisible light, a different type of light, but it actually is a form of light in the dark matter and the dark void. And so I feel like this time of this great awakening is one of the tripping stones, is like, how do we navigate this dark void? It might be really helpful to kind of collate different experiences of people who've had positive or made their way through the dark void and like Barbara and Brennan, and don't have really a challenge with it, because I feel like you were saying, you need to do your shadow work to be balanced, otherwise it's kind of dangerous. I feel like on the macro level, if we don't have, I don't necessarily think you should travel there intentionally. And the training that I got from Jeanette was, don't do the midworld journeys and don't go to the lower world if you have any association of negativity from your religious upbringing or cultural upbringing. Try to always go to the upper world when your journeys, but oftentimes my spirits would take me to the lower world or to the midworld when it was the right time. So I didn't ever venture there myself. I followed that guidance. But then when I did have those experiences, they were really positive, and I just kind of thought this, to balance, again, what I'm saying on the macro level is a lot of the light void and rainbow void experiences, if you want to call it the midworld heart, kind of heart openings, like Adyashanti talks about that as well. I see that a lot in our culture spoken of and discussed. And like you said, the dark void ones maybe not be discussed as much because we maybe pathologize the pathology that's there. Whereas I actually see it as maybe just a natural imbalance, that if we send the light like we do, like we hear you saying and Barbara and Brennan saying, and if we also are more balanced interpersonally with our own darkness, maybe we have a different relationship with it. We understand it. It's not so threatening, even if it is scary for good reason at times to be aware of the imbalance. So yeah, just I also just want to say I've heard of this concept called root to rise, which I believe is something in yogic traditions and Ayurvedic traditions. So again, talking about that balance, like not necessarily intentionally going to the dark world or the dark void or the lower world, but preparing people if it calls to you, and maybe collating some guidance with that might be really helpful. So that was just my main thought.
Thank you for your comments, Kamala.
Yvonne, if I could share, Emma sent a note to everybody on your chat line versus his last dialogue, is to check out the film Astral City. When you go through that film, it does have a lot of good references on the subject matter. available on YouTube in some places. It's made in Brazil. And trying to bring everything back up out of the dark. You mentioned Howard Storm, so I'm going to open with a question. I'm going to close with a question too. Howard Storm, he took his life, that was pretty self-focused, and went into service of others. And I know of another one, Daniel Brinkley, his last experience was also distressing. And from that, he started the Twilight Brigade, a great service of hospice for veterans. Yeah, this is out of the blue question for you, but if you could reflect, maybe you know of somebody else that had a distressing NDE and turned it into a life of service for others. It started the finding your way home.
Yeah, that is wonderful. And so I just want to end with that, because we're at the end of our time and we're going to have to move into closing. But that just because somebody has a distressing NDE or a distressing psychic or out lower world experience, as you were saying, Kamala, that it doesn't mean that they can't get personal growth out of that experience, that it couldn't be a stimulus for a tremendous amount of personal growth. So I think it's important not to use the word negative. I mean, I made that mistake in the past. I used to call these negative experiences, but then I realized, no, that's not the correct word. The correct word is that they're distressing or difficult, because how you respond from that can vary. And some people can use those experiences as an impetus, as Linda said, to change their life in a very positive direction, or as Kamala was saying, to maybe embrace some of their inner shadow work that they hadn't done before, that they didn't realize. So they could be propelling very positive growth. So I think at this point we're ending the question and answer period, and I believe John Spar is going to speak next.
Finally, I figured out how to unmute myself. I just want to say what a complete presentation, Yvonne. I mean, I've been studying the subject for a long time, and I can't think of anything you left out in the realm of STEs and NDEs. So I want to thank you for your professor-like presentation. I can see that you have that, you definitely have that in you.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. I want to thank Robert for having introduced me in the beginning, and thank you for your work and Linda's work and Diane's work on SAI. And I'm looking forward to more meetings and more excellent speakers. Just want to thank you for having me here.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'd like to go ahead and thank everyone for coming or for joining us. And if you haven't subscribed yet to Spiritual Awakenings International, please go to our website, spiritualawakeningsinternational.org, and please do so. And please pass the word